Alrighty, we got 4 more to make. And I've only got 1 more of these left. So, let's see what we can find in here. I don't want that one. It will take that one. So there's 2. Let's do a plain one. And we'll do that one. Yeah, I tell you, let's take that one out. And let's put that one in. Alright. So, now then, we've got, alright, these right here will be the stripes going down. So there is 2. So I need, let's see, I need 4. Where's 4? 4 down here. Nope, right over here is 4. Okay. Right here's 4. We'll put these together. Take those 2 out. And let's see. 4. So here is 4. And then we need another one to go down the side there. Alright, now we got the corners to go. So here is 1, 2, 3. I got 3 here. Okay, here's 4. We'll put those with those. There's 4. So this one's full, and this one's full, and I don't think I have any more 4s. I don't reckon. Let me see. I don't think I need 4s. I think I need 2s. Alright, let me see. Alright, this will be the middle. And then these will be the stripes. These will be 2. I don't think I want them to, I want them different colors. So that would be 2 there. And then 2, oh, let's go with these. 2 here. So those will be the ones that are cut down the side. That one is done. Alright, now we have the middle. And then we have the strips. And, oh come on. Then we have the triangles. So that makes 2. Alrighty. And we have, wait a minute, okay. The middle, the strips, one of the triangles, 2 of the triangles. So there's those. Alrighty. Now, we have the bottom one, the middle one, and then we have the strips, one triangle, two triangles. So I think that will cover it. Alright, let's see what we can do about playing with them and getting them done. Alright, now these are going to be the triangles. So if I can't go ahead and cut them down. Alright, let's make this plain as day. This video needs to not have any kids around it. If you're faint at heart or whatever, don't listen to it. You can watch the video and put the volume down. But I do want to make it plain and clear that Set is the only religion the government recognizes. This is why you don't trust the government. This is so disturbing. It is not a good video. It is very disturbing. So, warning is advised very strongly.
The salon owner said that the thin, pale man with blonde hair, aka Gary, was, quote, probably one of the most gentle people you will ever know, end quote. He's always got time to give kids a hug when they're crying, Grover was quoted as saying at the time. He's just a really kind person. After he was arrested, Gary got out on bond and took part-time jobs cleaning houses and washing windows in order to pay off his mounting legal bills and day-to-day expenses. While facing the most horrific of charges, Gary stayed with his friends on couches and in spare bedrooms, and continued to be closely associated with the Dolores Street Baptist Church in San Francisco. The indictment that Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Gray had sought from the grand jury charged Gary Hambright with only one child. In the actual documents, he was accused of and committing a lewd and lascivious act on a child. In March, 3 months after Gary Hambright's arrest, all of the aforementioned charges were dismissed. At the time, and in the press, U.S. District Court Judge William Schwartzer, who was overseeing the case, stated that he refused to allow the admission of so-called hearsay statements, specifically the comments that Tobin's 3-year-old son made to his brother and mother, and to the nurse and the doctor who examined him about the abuse. Several states allow exceptions of the hearsay rules in child cases, but federal courts and California state courts do not. Furthermore, U.S. District Court Judge William Schwartzer refused the hearsay evidence on March 4th and ruled that the Tobin son would not qualify as a competent witness because of his age. Essentially, this ruling, at least in my mind, states that a child cannot be a witness to a crime against them. This is not only a major slap in the face to all victims of childhood sexual abuse, but a direct slap in the face of justice as well. On March 20th, 1987, the U.S. Attorney's Office asked that the charges against Gary Hambright be dismissed without prejudice, meaning that he could possibly be retried if new evidence ever emerged. Prosecutor Susan Gray, at the time, directly informed the judge that she was aware of at least 12 more children that were claiming very similar things had happened to them at the hands of Mr. Gary. She informed him that not only were these allegations similar, but they mentioned the same perpetrator that the Tobin son had mentioned, and mentioned similar patterns and methods of abuse. Prosecutor Susan Gray, as it turned out, had counted on the fact that the judge would allow the admission of statements that the Tobin son made to his brother on the day he first said Mr. Gary heard him, as well as the similar comments he made to the nurse and doctor who examined him, and to the agents that interviewed him afterwards. The medical evidence and the perfect witness parents had made her even more confident when she was building this case, and she felt pretty confident that she'd be able to get a conviction. That's because Joyce Tobin herself, the boy's mother, was a nurse. Mike Tobin was a West Point graduate and a nuclear engineer. They had no reason to lie or fabricate these things, and it also added more validity to the examination of the boy's. But the Army's supposed independent and thorough investigation of the Tobin son's allegations had gotten off to a shaky start when Army Criminal Investigative Special Agent Mark Remsen was assigned to interview the child. As it turned out, Special Agent Mark Remsen had never interviewed a child younger than 8 years old, and while Army regulations required that the interview be taped, Remsen had never used a videotaping device while conducting an interview either. This seems like he was the first, it seems like this is this guy's first day of work when you really think about it. I mean, he's completely inexperienced on every single facet that he should be experienced in. The regulation was later changed, but the damage had already been done. The videotape in question was to be singled out repeatedly as an example of how the children had supposedly been coached and prodded to tell their stories. That was the narrative that was already being concocted, that these children were somehow coached to tell these fantastical, incredibly disturbing stories. For what reason exactly it was being alleged that these children were being coached, we still don't know. That's something that we always see too, that, oh, these allegations like this, these parents must have been putting these ideas in these children's heads, or these investigators must have been doing this. I understand that, has happened sometimes in the past. But I mean, a case like this, when you've got all these different children with corroborating evidence, corroborating each other's stories, talking to their parents and their doctors and their therapists who are interviewing them, giving the exact same details, and medical records confirming it, it just doesn't make sense. Joyce Tobin, the boy's mother, according to court records, said that during the interview, quote, apparently, in an attempt to establish rapport with my son, the CID investigator said that Mr. Gary was bad and should be spanked. He said this numerous times. Thereafter, in the week that followed when my son spoke about Mr. Gary, he described Mr. Gary as bad and said he should be spanked. Prior to the CID interview, my son had never said anything like that or attempted to make any value judgment about what had happened to him. He just reported what had happened to him, Joyce Tobin told the prosecution, and this was just the very beginning of the cover-up. Now, we can view this situation in different ways. Maybe, in a skeptic's mind, the investigator really was just inexperienced and said the wrong things at the wrong time. It's indeed plausible, I'll give you that. However, when you consider every other piece of evidence in this case, this behavior seems to paint a bit of a darker picture. Was that investigator attempting to plant false evidence in the child's mind so that later on investigators and officials could take a look at the child's testimony and throw it out, based simply on the fact that the kid was repeating lies that the investigator had planted in his own already traumatized mind? It's a tactic that's definitely been used before that I can guarantee you will continue to be used in the future. It's something that we've seen in cases like the Elms Guesthouse case in England that we're going to be investigating here on the channel soon, where false evidence was introduced into a case by the authorities in order to get the legitimate evidence questioned, thrown out, and delegitimized. But that's just food for thought. Let's get back to the story. With the charges dismissed at this point, Susan Gray's attempt at securing a simple single conviction had failed. And for a while, the case went cold. No further developments emerged, and no authorities acted to try and find justice in this affair. The courts would not hear of the Presidio again until the end of September 1987, nearly a year after the first allegations were made. Throughout that year, the Tobins were disappointed, but they weren't defeated. In that almost year's time, they had begun calling and writing congressmen, attempting to make noise about the that they in their heart of hearts knew had happened to their son, calling and meeting with Army officials at the Presidio itself. By April of 1987, another battle had shaped up outside of the courtrooms. And this was a pretty disturbing development. Instead of actively trying to investigate the alleged that occurred on the Presidio campus, the Army instead had begun insisting that their daycare center was safe, that all the victims had been identified, and that the issue was already solved. But parents who had children enrolled in the daycare and preschool feared otherwise, because they knew that their own children had mentioned people other than Gary Hambright, people who still worked at the daycare center, as being involved in the At first, it was just the Tobins alone who kept asking, were proper procedures followed? Was everything necessary really done? Did you check on that? What about the other children? But by April of that year, the Tobins had been joined by other families whose kids claimed they were families like the Runyons, the Adams-Thompsons, the Dorseys, the Foxes. Most of these people had never met before, but they were to meet many times in the months to come. A massive scandal was brewing. The first priority of all these families was to get another letter mailed to the parents of other children who had attended the daycare center who they felt like the Army and U.S. government had let down and endangered. But the Army saw no need for that. Why are you doing this? Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, the Director of Personnel and Community Activities, asked Mike Tobin. Because parents need to know what's happening, Mike told him during a conversation. That very letter that these concerned families played a part in getting sent out was delayed for 2 more weeks, while Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer argued over whether the number of victims mentioned in the letter should be 32 or 37. 2 weeks for an issue like that? Come on. Issues like this need to be acted upon immediately. When Joyce Tobin and fellow victim's mother Brenda Fox went to Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer's office to discuss the finishing and sending of the letter, Meyer told them that he didn't have time to talk, Fox recalls, and she also claimed that he told the two mothers that he was on his way to make a videotape about the CDC, about it being a model daycare center. So this powerful military guy didn't have time to talk to the family members of victims, and instead he was prioritizing heading to go film a video about how good and perfect and not scandalous the daycare is. When at the exact same moment, he actually had two mothers trying to talk to him whose children were there. It doesn't really make sense. But according to Brenda Fox, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, during that interaction said, "Despite what you may believe, this is a model daycare center." She later said, "I sat there thinking, this man has no soul. We told him the numbers were wrong. He said, no, they're not. We waited while he called and found out the numbers were wrong." Under the signatures of Joyce and Mike Tobin, Gretchen and Dennis Runyon, Sue and Tom Dorsey, Michelle and Larry Adams Thompson, and Brenda and Don Fox, this letter, dated April 29, 1987, was mailed to parents. "We feel you should know that there are now 37 children identified by the authorities as suspected victims," the letter said in part. "We are very concerned that there may be more children affected and in need of help, yet remain unidentified. These parents and families of suspected victims came from all walks of life and all sorts of different backgrounds. The core group of parents at the center of the affair consisted of professionals, doctors, a dentist, a nuclear scientist. They spoke out loud and often, and raised their voices when they needed to. Whenever speaking to the media, the parents claimed they spoke for those who could not, the children and the enlisted people who, they said, were too afraid to risk their military career to speak out about what really happened on the Presidio campus. To them, the only explanation for the silence from all the enlisted people was the fact that they needed their jobs, and that many families, parents, and employees needed that daycare. However, the core group could afford daycare elsewhere. When it first started, they had the chance to be heroes, Melanie Thompson, a parent of one of the victims, once said about the Army. Instead, they just didn't want to believe it. Now they're just trying to cover it up like a bad dream. But as time wore on and more dark truths came to light, this story just kept diving down and down, further and further towards hell. Now, here's something fun. None of the parents who were protesting the Army's handling of the case knew that the signs of trouble had begun to surface at the Child Development Center at least 6 years earlier. And none of these parents knew that the Army had been dealing with problems at its daycare centers for years before the Presidio case broke. When the first allegations broke and concerns arose, the Army said nothing about the prior cases of documented child sex abuse at West Point and Fort Dix. The Army said nothing of an investigation 6 years prior involving John Gunnerson, the Presidio's top daycare official and the supervisor of the daycare center during the time that Gary Hambright allegedly the children. But let's go back in time for a second. In 1982, years before the first allegations were brought forward with the children of the Presidio, a man named John Gunnerson was employed in a somewhat powerful position at the Presidio. His official job title was Child Support Services Coordinator at the Childhood Development Center, responsible for the training of the center's staff. And he was, according to many, a caring, normal man. However, when he was arrested on charges of assaulting an employee of the center, Pearl Broadnax, the opinions of John Gunnerson on the base suddenly shifted. Pearl Broadnax herself had been complaining about conditions at the center and the allegedly deplorable treatment of the children that she witnessed while working there. She claimed that she was branded a troublemaker and was often brought in, questioned, and grilled by her supervisors about her allegedly unsatisfactory job performance. But this whole thing took a dark turn on February 3rd, 1982, when Pearl and Gunnerson argued over the use of scissors by the children. According to Pearl, John asked her to go into another room to continue the discussion, but Pearl said she wanted to remain in the playroom. At this time, according to an investigative report of the incident, Gunnerson grabbed Broadnax by the left arm above her waist and pulled her towards him. She then told Gunnerson, "Don't touch me," to which she replied, "I'm not touching you." She felt that she was in fear of bodily harm at this point in the incident. And when officially questioned, John Gunnerson declined to be interviewed about the incident, but responded to questions through Presidio spokesman Bob Mahoney. "I did not grab Mrs. Broadnax. I did not assault her, and I had no intention of harming her," he related to Mahoney. In the course of our conversation, Mrs. Broadnax became agitated and appeared to be losing control of herself. I attempted to calm her by lightly touching her arm to guide her out from the room where we were talking. At least, that's what John Gunnerson claimed happened. Unsurprisingly, the charge against John Gunnerson was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. The incident could possibly be dismissed as an unfortunate misunderstanding, except that the ensuing investigation at the time led to more allegations of physical and sexual abuse of children at the same center, according to former military police investigator Ed Albanoski, who was then the chief of juvenile investigations at the Presidio. It seemed like a can of worms had suddenly been opened. Eventually graduating from the Presidio to the title of deputy sheriff in Santa Clara County, Ed Albanoski called the original author of this article Linda Goldston after he read one of her stories about the Presidio case. When I read the paper, I almost fell out of my chair, he said. I couldn't believe Gunnarsson was still working there. While interviewing Pearl at the daycare center after she had called military police officers about Gunnarsson, Ed learned that Pearl was concerned about more than just the alleged threat of harm to herself. She also alleged that employees had touched children's improperly. Pearl had provoked an investigation of the center a year earlier, after talking to parents who said they felt their children were discriminated against because they were minorities. Pearl also said in a documented accusation that she had seen the then director of the center hit a child in the mouth, an injury which caused him to bleed. In a telephone interview from her home in Alabama, Pearl told Linda, the author of the original article, that she had complained many times about the problems at the center during the 4 years she worked there, but, quote, just gave up. Nobody seemed to be concerned. I ended up having a nervous breakdown over that, end quote. She was quoted as saying, right before I left, I saw a woman beat a kid until he just threw up, she said. I did all I could to get something done about that. They removed her, but she was back working there after I left. After Pearl made her thoughts and initial observations and allegations known, Captain Robert J. Meyer was appointed to look into the allegations for the commander of the Presidio. And once again, we'll see a similar pattern here of ignoring issues, allowing problems to fester, and covering up horrific misdeeds. You see, in a letter summarizing his findings, Captain Robert J. Myers said, at least 3 of the Child Care Center staff have been threatened with the loss of their jobs if they speak out and tell the truth about how the Child Care Center is being managed and how the minority children are treated. After this letter was finished and published, a hearing was held at the Presidio about these allegations in the year 1981. The director in question was placed on leave for a brief moment before being reinstated, and it seemed as if life went right back to normal. All of those allegations were forgotten
Alright,
about.
I hope this is going to show up. I want you to look at the way the black looks. Now this is old black. And this is new black. I don't know. Let's see if we can do it this way. There we go. Look at the different blacks. This is thinner, way thinner. And this is thicker. Say, this is 100 count, and this is only 50 count. Alrighty.
Uninvestigated. The physical, the children getting smacked. The other adults and teachers playing with children's. It's almost like that stuff never happened. And so the next year, when Ed Albanoski reported the sex abuse allegations that he had heard to Presidio officials, he was told, quote, to stop any investigation, I was told there was nothing to look into, that Gunnarsson would be dealt with through his command channels, end quote. Military police investigators report number 0019382MP102682047, dated February 4th, 1982, was filed on the incident. Ed Albanoski, after all these years, still holds on to a copy of that report. He sensed back then that it might be important someday. And thank God he did that, because the Army didn't take this whole thing quite as seriously. This particular case was not known to any of us in the chain of command. Presidio Commander Joseph V. Rafferty said, when questioned about those older allegations, Mr. Gunnarsson had one of the finest reputations in the Army with respect to running a child care center. Bizarre. Very bizarre to defend a guy accused of physical assault against an employee and sexual assault against children. But a year after he was arrested, John Gunnarsson was cited in an inspection report by officials from the U.S. Army Forces Command for doing an excellent job as the Child Support Services Coordinator. The staff training program he developed utilizing the military child care modules is model for the Army. This glowing praise was showered onto John Gunnarsson just a little over a year after he was accused of physically abusing an employee, physically abusing children, and either taking part in, or at minimum turning a blind eye to the sexual abuse of children there. But even though the Army wasn't listening to them or paying attention, these allegations of abuse of the daycare center would continue to surface. In a somewhat notorious incident, former Army Captain Gary Boswell approached John Gunnarsson in April 1985 after picking up his daughter at the daycare center. She had a red spot on her hand where she had been burned, she said. The teacher burned me. This girl was taking the kids and taking a magnifying glass and holding their hands until they jerked their hand away and cried, said Boswell. I went to see Gunnarsson and wasn't terribly pleased. He said he'd look into it. We came back the next day, and he said he had talked to the person, that there were no eyewitnesses, and it's your daughter's word against hers, so we can't do anything. We took our daughter out of the daycare center a short time later. So, according to another independent witness, this female teacher was taking children's hands, putting them under a magnifying glass and burning them. And then, when presented with the child and the injury and the allegations, the director of the center takes no action against the employee and just says, oh, we don't believe the girl. Weird. Then, a year or so later, a mother named Sue Dorsey contacted John Gunnarsson in June of 1986 to complain about a sexual incident she says she witnessed with her own two eyes at the center. Sue Dorsey, the wife of Army Captain Tom Dorsey, a physician, said she had just dropped her daughter off at the daycare center and was walking out of the building when she noticed, quote, a woman on her hands and knees, bent over, putting her hands in a little girl's. The woman took her hands out from the little girl's and put them under the little girl's and tickled her on both, and then went back down into the vaginal area and tickled her there, end quote. Now obviously this is something really disturbing to see with your own two eyes, and Sue knew that whatever the hell she just saw, that it was not right. But after relating the incident to the assistant director of the center, Sue said she was told a similar story to the other similar stories that other concerned parents and employees were told over the years. Sue was told that the grown adult woman that she had seen the little girl in was just playing innocent tickling games. But Sue Dorsey wasn't satisfied with this response, so she then went to John Gunnarsson, who, she says, replied, so what you're telling me is that she tickled the little girl on her parts. After this conversation, according to Sue, she then returned home and called Gunnarsson later in the day. He said, I'm going to write something up in her personnel file. But once again, Sue felt that this wasn't enough action. Finally, after further calls to the captain who supervised the civilian employees at the center, Sue got some good news. She was told that the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, would investigate the case. But Colonel Rafferty would later comment on the investigation, saying that it proved that it could not be substantiated that any had occurred. From my understanding of the actual involved, there was a question of just exactly what was clearly a tickling type of incident that could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. I suspect the investigators took the caregiver's interpretation of what it was. After all that effort, after trying to raise the alarm that was occurring at the Presidio for months, Sue Dorsey had gotten nowhere. She was told time and time again that this would be all looked into, that some sort of action would be taken, but nothing ever happened. Time and time again, these investigations and investigators claimed, yeah, we looked at it, but we're just going to believe the perpetrator. Screw the victim. We don't care about what they're saying. Sue Dorsey was defeated. And a year later, Sue Dorsey learned that her own daughter had been abused while at the Presidio Child Care Center. Sue Dorsey and the other parents would also learn that there had been abuse cases involving daycare centers at several other Army bases across the U.S. Cases of that were hidden from the mainstream media and in a way covered up. One of the most serious cases of child sex abuse occurred at West Point, that is, until the Presidio. In July 1984, a 3-year-old girl was brought to the emergency room at the West Point Hospital with a lacerated. The child at the time told the doctor who examined her that a teacher at the West Point daycare center was the one who hurt her, that a teacher was the one who had damaged her private area. In August of 1984, at West Point, another parent came forward. By the end of the year, 50 children had been interviewed by investigators. Starting to sound familiar? Well, the similarities do not end there. The children at West Point, years prior to the emergence of the stories of the children at the Presidio, told stories that would, in time, become horrifyingly familiar. The children said that they had been ritually abused. They said that they had excrement smeared on their bodies and had been forced to eat feces and drink urine. They also said they were taken away from the daycare center and photographed while they were being. And these children also said that they were told if they ever told anyone anything about what was happening to them, either they or their families would be killed. Sounds exactly like the allegations from the Presidio. Some parents at the time alleged that they believed the Army had tried its best to cover up these cases. The whole underlying theme was that the image of West Point was more important than dealing with the reality of what happened, said Dr. Walter Grote, whose 2-year-old daughter was among the children allegedly abused at the center.
This is Dr. Walter Grote, would you stand, sir? Whose daughter was allegedly abused at West Point, the United States Military Academy. You were a captain in the United States Army. Aside from what allegedly happened to your daughter, which I know you allege was part of a satanic cult, and having nothing to do with this man, I state again for the record, what is your feeling, sir, on the fact that a serving officer in the United States Army is also a professed Satanist, a high-ranking person?
Well, I think in this election year, we've heard a lot about values, Geraldo. We've heard a lot that our little children should be saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Mr. Aquino has identified himself as an antichrist. He preaches that as the leader of the Temple Set. I don't think I'm misquoting him. I find it inconceivable that we can have candidates talking about one nation under God and having our children say that, yet by the same token, we can have somebody in our army as a colonel leading our troops in battle who are opposed to the very concept of God and whose whole purpose it is to fight against God.
At the time that the article about this was written, Dr. Walter Grote had moved on and moved to a different state, where he had a private medical practice in New Jersey. A former Army captain, Dr. Walter Grote actually turned down a promotion to major in 1984 to protest the Army's handling of the daycare case at West Point. He was, once again, just like the other parents, well aware that the problem at the point had started long before. In August of 1983, nearly a year before the case broke out at West Point, a 22-month-old child had been murdered by the mother's boyfriend, an Army staff sergeant. After a court-martial hearing, the sergeant was given an 18-month suspended sentence and dishonorable discharge. Yes, you heard that correctly. A man had murdered his girlfriend's 22-month-old child and was given no prison time. Colonel Richard C. Eckert, a doctor that was then in charge of West Point's child protection case management team, was outraged at the leniency of the sentence. I mean, seriously, who in their right mind wouldn't be? In an August 1st, 1983 letter to Lieutenant General Willard Scott Jr., the then superintendent of West Point, Colonel Richard Eckert wrote, "The community has received a devastating message. West Point and the Army take child lightly and do not consider it a major offense." Yes, those words are in writing. And yes, those words rang true. The guy that murdered the 22-month-old baby was let off scot-free, said Dr. Pat Jones, a former pediatrician at West Point who moved away from the area and eventually opened up a private practice in Texas. They just kicked him out of the Army to prevent any publicity. Dr. Pat Jones, who believes his 15-month-old daughter was at the center at West Point, was so outraged that he resigned from the Army. "I tried to resign from the Alumni Association. I feel ashamed for even being from that place," he was quoted as saying. But once again, at the end of the day, no indictments were returned in the West Point cases.